Most scholars seem to agree that Galatians 2:15-21 is the center of Paul's argument in his letter to the Galatians. If not central to Paul's argument, this text is certainly central to the many debates which surround the book today. Perhaps the battles rage because in this highly debated text, we find the very essence of the gospel that Paul preached and defended. In this seminar, I'll highlight 5 fundamental gospel truths which flow from Galatians 2:15-21. First, the depravity of man. Second, forensic justification. Third, the insufficiency of human works. Fourth, faith alone in Christ alone. And finally, spiritual transformation. Let's begin with the depravity of man. Paul's riff on justification through faith alone in Christ alone, apart from any works of the law, which we'll address below, is set up by verse 15. In verses 11 to 14, Paul recounts his rebuke of Peter for having hypocritically pulled away from eating with Gentiles. Peter knew the nature of salvation. He did not need a lecture from Paul on this matter. In the language of the New Perspective types, Peter's problem was sociological, not soteriological. His sin was hypocrisy. So in verse 15, with an almost sarcastic tone, Paul appeals to this knowledge, the knowledge of Peter and all Christ-following Jews, that everyone stands equally condemned before God. Certainly sinful Gentiles, but also ethnic Jews. This universal lostness is referred to later in chapter 3, verse 10 and 11, and it's developed fully by Paul in his letter to the Romans, Romans 1:18 through chapter 3, verse 20. That no one is found righteous before God and are therefore equally in need of being justified. It's the starting point for Paul's gospel. So let's move on to forensic justification. So in this brief turn of phrase in verse 15, Paul has established the problem. All are sinners. This leads to his explanation of justification in the verses to follow, but especially in verse 16 where he uses the verb dikaiao 3 times. The meaning of this word is critical to debates about Pauline theology, but more importantly, I believe it's at the very heart of the gospel. Dikaiao means to render a favorable verdict, vindicate. This forensic or legal definition, it's reflected in its cognates as well, diakasune and dikaios. The Old Testament contains numerous examples of both sinners and saints standing before the judge to receive either divine condemnation or favor. The eschatological expectation in the Old Testament is of a coming king who will ascend to the throne and execute judgment upon the earth. This carries over to the New Testament as well, where we learn that it's Jesus who's been appointed as judge of both the living and the dead. In fact, one day we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ when we'll each receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. So in 3:10, Paul declares that all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. Yet what is the nature of that curse? Some might suggest that it's exclusion from the people of God. Others might suggest that the curse is enslavement to sin or oppression by forces of evil. Instead, the legal understanding of justification informs us that the curse is the wrath of God. Sinners stand condemned. So, the great problem is that we're all sinners, Jews and Gentiles alike, and we must one day stand before a holy God. The natural response is human effort. Think of the crowd on the day of Pentecost, who after listening to Peter's sermon, they cry out, "What must we do to be saved?" That's a good question, and a natural question to Peter's preaching. However, Paul asserts in Galatians 2:16 that by works of the law, no one will be justified. It is widely agreed that works of the law simply means doing what the law requires. Its larger significance, however, is more controversial. Some should suggest that what Paul had in mind were only certain works of the Torah that especially related to Jewish identity, such as circumcision, dietary laws, and Jewish festivals. Therefore, admittance into the covenantal people of God does not require these particular works. Others, uncomfortable with E.P. Sanders' covenantal nomism, might say that it refers specifically and concretely to the Torah, to all the law of Moses. However, there is an abundance of evidence to suggest that by works of the law, Paul is referring to all works that any person might do in order to earn favor with God. At the end of verse 16, Paul quotes Psalm 143, verse 2. Here the psalmist pleads for divine mercy because no one living can possibly stand before a righteous judge. Paul makes a couple of significant changes in citing this psalm. First, he replaces no living person with no flesh. In the Greek, sarx, the term that Paul uses throughout his writings to describe human moral inability. He then adds, by the words of the law. Therefore, Paul includes works of the law within the realm of deeds that no one can sufficiently fulfill in order to receive a positive verdict from the divine judge. If there were any doubt as to Paul's underlying theological meaning, Titus 3:5 speaks clearly and unequivocally to this point. Now let's move on to faith in Christ. Given that no one can stand before God based on their own deeds, Paul presents faith in Christ as the only alternative. The key phrase, pisteos Christou Iesu, is found in verse 16 and has been traditionally translated faith in Christ Jesus, demonstrating an objective use of the genitive. However, there are a growing number of interpreters who argue that Christou Iesu is a subjective use of the genitive and that the phrase should be therefore rendered the faith of Christ, or perhaps Christ's faithfulness. Leaving us a reading then in 2:16, we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by Christ's faithfulness. Even if one would accept a subjective genitive here, while there could be theological ramifications, and indeed many use it to support their alternative theories in Paul, the subjective genitive does not necessarily lead to different conclusions. It should also be noted that there are many other passages that affirm Christ's faithfulness and its relationship to human salvation, so this isn't a particular problem. In any case, Mu articulates a number of convincing arguments for the traditional objective translation. The most compelling reason is because it logically matches Paul's overall argument, which contrasts one's works with one's faith. Ergon namu versus pisteos Christou. This is reinforced in chapter 3 with reference to Abraham's faith, who believed God and was declared righteous. Paul's logic would fail at this point if pisteos Christou were translated objectively. So we've seen that according to Paul's gospel, sinful humans can find favor before the divine judge, not because of their own deeds. They will always be insufficient, but only by faith, which is the opposite of works, in Jesus Christ. There remains one more critical element to Paul's presentation of his gospel here, and it's reflected in the phrase en Cristo, found in verse 17. Many are of the opinion that en Cristo refers to the believer's vital union with Christ, and is actually the center of Pauline theology rather than justification, as the traditional Lutheran approach suggests. It's on this point where I diverge from Mu, who suggests that en Cristo refers to the spiritual union with Christ, so that both justification and transformation, or sanctification, are results of this mystical union. However, I would argue that en Cristo should be understood instrumentally. It is parallel to the construction en namo in 3:11. So it would be more precise to understand en Cristo as by Christ or through Christ, recognizing that it is on the basis of Christ's righteousness, his life, death, and resurrection, that God justifies. This forensic understanding of en Cristo continues on in the following verses, 3:20 and 21, in which Paul writes that Christ lives en emoi, in me. Carson and Allen propose that Paul has in mind Christ's life on Paul's behalf, invoking the doctrine of imputed righteousness and the positive legal standing that represents. And so this way, we see that not even the good deeds that I as a justified believer might accomplish today in any way make me more worthy in God's sight. Rather, it is Christ's life shining through me.